what I wanted to do was quickly, in the time we have, cover the 55 years that I've been associated with the Office of Naval Research. So that's a minute a year. Because I don't think that many of you realize, and I don't think any of you were around when I reported to ONR on March 10th, 1967. Was there anyone in ONR March 10th, 1967? So I want to tell you your history. Because I don't think you realize the pivotal role the Office of Naval Research played, certainly in my world of deep submergence engineering and science. ONR has always been the lead organization and is responsible for so many things that I don't think you realize you're responsible for. So I'd like to really focus on what you might not know about ONR. But as Tom said, and I'm used to working in the dark, so if you want to take the house lights down to what the fire marshal will permit, I'd like to immerse you in that underwater world. But as Tom said, I actually began my military career as a combat infantry officer during Vietnam. I was trained for terrain warfare. I was actually qualified #1 out of 1,400 as a sniper. I'm a pretty good shot. And anyway, it was a very, very interesting beginning to my military career because terrain was everything. But then while I was pursuing my undergraduate degree and going through Army ROTC at University of California, Santa Barbara, I also worked for North American Aviation, Ocean Systems Operations on a totally different venue, and that was in the development of deep diving submersibles. In fact, our group unsuccessfully bid on building Alvin, lost it to the winner of the bid, which was 3M's, Cheerios company, because they didn't think we were committed to the program, and as soon as 3M got it, they sold it to Litton Industries. So I think they messed up on that one. I was also, believe it or not, a dolphin trainer at the time, working for developing dolphins for military support. So that was in that time frame. But then when I got my orders, March 10th, 1967, I was called to active duty. My commission was transferred to the Navy, and I got in my little VW in California and drove across the United States and reported for active duty in the Fargo building on First Naval District in Boston branch office, specifically assigned to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which at the time was 85% of its support. 85% of its support came from the Navy. It was very focused on Navy problems. And many of the people there had served in the military one way or another. So it's a very, very different world I came to that's now there now, where no one, I think, has served in the military other than myself. So it's changed a lot. But then just before I got there, Alvin had arrived in 1964, and then as we all know, there was this collision of a strategic air command bomber with its fueling tanker off above Spain, and two hydrogen bombs dropped. One landed on a farm field, and the United States bought the entire farm, dug everything up, and carried everything away, including the farm. But another one was then lost in the ocean, and Alvin found it. And then working with the Curve vehicle, the first ROV developed by the Navy was the Curve vehicle. And that was then used to actually recover the hydrogen bomb. So then, shortly thereafter, running parallel with my academic career, and as a naval officer assigned to Woods Hole's academic and engineering program, I was also doing a lot of parallel work with operational Navy assets, in particular the research submarine NR1, which was based nearby at the submarine base in Groton, New London. I spent 30 years using the NR1 on a variety of military programs, and some that we went public on, but many that we did not. So I've always been living this dual track. Actually dual track itself within the ocean sciences as a marine geologist and geophysicist, but in the engineering development as well. And then a dual track as a civilian academician and a military officer. Shortly after I got there, they lost Alvin. Alvin was lost on a launch. Fortunately, all 3 occupants got out of the submarine before it sank, but it then went to the bottom. And then we actually mounted this massive salvage operation from 5,200 feet of water using the Illuminaut to actually insert in the open hatch. We were able to see from these photographs from the Mizar, the photograph could see that the hatch was opened. As it should have been, it was dogged in the open position because the pilot stood above that when they launched, and that's why it was still open. We inserted a toggle down into the open hatch and then free-spooled it to the surface, handed it to the crane on the support ship, raised it but did not lift it out of the water, then took it, literally drove 100 and some miles at a very slow speed, towing Alvin beneath us, and then put it back on the water in 80 feet of water off Martha's Vineyard, and then it was a pretty easy lift from there. And then we had to rebuild it. But then after completing my active duty service and I entered the reserve, I then went on to complete my PhD in marine geology and geophysics while being employed by the Deep Submergence Group at Woods Hole. And you know, most of my life has been being in the right place at the right time. And certainly at that point in time in 1960, the whole concept of plate tectonics was just exploding. All across the academic world, around the world, was this theory that the Earth was actually made up of large crustal slabs that were able to then create oceanic crust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that led to a major meeting when I was a graduate student. Harry Hess, who was a naval commander during World War II, famous for his mapping with echo sounders of guyots in the Pacific, chaired a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences at Princeton. It became known as the Princeton Workshop, where I was asked, because I was doing my PhD on using Alvin as an underwater jeep in the Gulf of Maine, I was asked to give a presentation to the Academy and to all the assembled people there. And it was quite frightful. I was the only non-PhD in the room, and if you've ever been in the lecture pits at Princeton, it's like an operating room. They're just right on top of you. And I'm looking up at the gods of Maurice Ewing, Frank Press, Fred Spiess, all the gods of oceanography. I'm telling them that they really needed to take off their geophysical hats and put on their geology hats and do the field geology necessary to test the concepts of plate tectonics on the ground. I'll never forget at that evening we gave my presentation, Maurice Ewing, who had left Woods Hole and created Lamont, was sitting there. He'd had a couple, and he looked at this young kid across the table. It's always funny. I've always been the young kid in the room, and I think I'm now the oldest one in the room, and I'm not quite used to it because I never have grown up. He looked at me, he wagged his finger at me, he says, "Son, we're probably going to endorse this program to explore the mid-Atlantic ridge, but if you fail, we're going to take your titanium hull and make it into 1,000,000 titanium paper clips." And you know, if you've ever had Ewing wag his finger at you, you know, you've been told. But fortunately, it was highly successful, but critical to its success. Critical to the success of the first human exploration of the largest mountain range on the Earth to test the theory of plate tectonics on the ground was getting access to Navy platforms that were highly classified at the time to make detailed bathymetric maps. The two premier ships at the time were the USNS Bowditch and the USS Dutton, Liberty ships that had these monstrous arrays, SAS arrays mounted on their hull, giving great stability and guide, and they had a great guidance system to go out and map. And we were able to convince the Navy to lend us those ships and do an unclassified survey of the mid-Atlantic ridge, which absolutely showed oceanographers for the first time the detail and complexity of underwater terrain, because we had been so used to echo sounders that with great interlocking hyperbolas that looked like Adrian's Acres, as they called it, in the deep scattering layer. The ocean floor was just, you couldn't see what was down there except, it was like taking a wet blanket and throwing it over a grand dinner table with all sorts of elaborate dishes and plates and candles, and you get like Google Earth, sort of a wet version of the ocean floor. And all of a sudden they took that wet blanket off when we got extremely detailed. And then the Navy, again through NRL, Bucky Buchanan and the MISAR came out with a Liebeck system funded by ONR at the time to create this unbelievable walk across the mid-ocean ridge with the Liebeck system. And then this, I'm wrong, we went from 2,500 meters, was what the original HY100 steel hull could do. And I needed to correct that when the Navy and NAVSEA and ONR funded the titanium hull that took us to 4,000 meters and now made it possible to reach the mid-ocean ridge spreading axis. And again, all of this would not have been possible without steadfast support from the Navy in bringing this technology online. And so the subsequent project, FAMOS with the French, FAMOS stood for French-American Undersea Ocean Study, Ocean Undersea Study, that really gave you the graphic, physical, on-the-ground confirmation that plate tectonics was in fact not a theory anymore, but it was a law, and again, it could not have been done had we not get this rich detail of the terrain we were working in. Again, Navy came up with, when we wanted to go to the deepest volcanoes on the Earth. The deepest active volcanoes are in a place called the Mid-Cayman Rise. It's what we call in geology a leaky transform fault. So instead of spreading or conversion or translation, it has a translational fault with a bend in it. And so for 90 kilometers, you actually have a miniature mid-Atlantic ridge or mid-ocean ridge. But it's so deep that it has the deepest volcanoes. They came in again, made the maps for us, sponsored by and then ONR, you must have it in your archives, a great film ONR made of this historic expedition that then was followed, followed when the Trieste II, and I made my deepest dives, 20,000 foot dives, down to that spreading center. Actually were able to sample the newly emerging volcanic lava, and it was so, we were recovering at such a great depth that when we brought it back, it started popping. The rocks started popping as the gas in the lattice structure of the lava was now expanding from 10,000 psi to 1 atmosphere, and it was popping like popcorn. Again, the Navy led the way when the USNS Dutton came in and mapped the portion of the mid-ocean ridge called the Galapagos Rift. And that led to probably, when people ask me what is the greatest discovery you've ever made, it was here. And I'll tell you why. ONR, we had an initial little vehicle system. We affectionately referred to it as a dope on a rope because it was on a non-conducting trawl wire where we would literally put in massive camera systems that Benthos had with 400-foot reels, and we would put timers on them, and we would literally lower this vehicle into this rugged terrain and tow it blind as a bat. All we knew was altitude. We had no forward-looking sonar, and you can see it was just trashing it. We put it in this wrecking, and by the time we brought it up, it was mangled, but it had all of these photographs. We discovered a new way of processing film on seawater because we didn't have much water out there. We were processing hundreds of thousands of color, high-speed Ektachrome images, but we did have a little sensor on it that could detect a change in temperature. And so we were flatlining most of the time at 4 degrees, which is the average temperature down there because that's the densest water gets is at 4, it falls down there. And then we got a spike. And when we brought it up, we processed the film. We had, ONR and DARPA had spearheaded the development of acoustic navigation system. The first automated acoustic navigation system was, again, Navy and DARPA developed. And we were able to know exactly where the camera one was that saw that spike in our 3-dimensional tracking system. and we found these massive hydrothermal vents. I mean, this was a world we had been taught in the biology books that the deep sea has very little life, because our biology book says that photosynthesis is the dominant driving engine of life on Earth, that the photonic energy of the sun comes in off the sun at the speed of light, captured in the chlorophyll of plants that then fix carbon, and that animals eat the carbon and we go up the food chain. And that's what we were told. And that's why we thought the deep sea would have some life, but not a lot of life, mostly driven by the particles that falling down from the euphotic zone that were feeding the deep sea, but not a lot of nutrients. Most dead organisms, as they fall through the ocean floor, are eaten 4 or 5 times. We call it the fecal express. As it passes through an organism, and by the time it goes to the 8th organism, there's hardly anything left that you want. And so we knew that there wasn't much nutrients getting down there, so that's why we didn't have much going on. And then all of a sudden, giant tube worms. It was just, I'll never forget bringing up the first one and calling. There were all geologists, Tom, on that discovery. No biologists wanted to go. They said it was a boring thing to look at rocks, and they turned us down. And we never let them forget that geologists made the greatest biological discovery ever made on Earth. And then we discovered that inside these organisms, these tube worms, I have one in my eye, 13 feet tall. It's sticking out its lung, and it's ingesting poisonous hydrogen sulfide gas. It then passed it on to a creature living inside its body in a classic symbiotic relationship where the creature didn't want to live in a spring where it's just being blown out. It needed a home. And these guys would live right where the vent water was coming up. And what a deal, what a conversation they must have said. Here's the deal, let me live in your body, this what we now call extremophiles, the thermophilic bacterium, living in the body and gut of these tube worms, also living in the body and gut of giant clams that had human-like blood, that when you opened the clam and dissected the first clam ever, and it had no internal organisms. It had no internal organisms because it atrophied all of that space for this cyanobacterium that had figured out over eons of time how to duplicate photosynthesis in the dark. And on a gas that's poisonous to humans and all plant. If you want to die a terrible death, inhale hydrogen sulfide gas. It's really not a good suggestion. And it revolutionized the biology books. So we'd thrown out the geology books with plate tectonics thanks to ONR. Now we threw out the biology books thanks to ONR. And now we're going to throw out the next one. But it raises this whole question. Are we alone in the universe? And the answer is absolutely not. That we are not alone in the universe. We may be cordoned off by the laws of physics of escaping our little area. Because when they say we found a Earth-like planet 1 million light years away, it's a long trip to get there. And so we will not get there. But we know more than likely that there is actually life within our own solar system. And that's driving our work on the moons of Saturn, Europa, and the moons of Jupiter, Europa, and the moons of Saturn, which is Enceladus, where we know that has a far bigger oceans. The oceans of Enceladus and Europa are much, much larger than the oceans of the world. We know that they have active volcanism due to their elliptical orbit around the great mass of Jupiter, which distorts them and it expands and contracts and causes through frictional expansion and contraction the genesis of magma. So we know highly likely that that will have life. I can't wait to get over it so that NASA can finally find life elsewhere on the planet that is dumber than heck, okay? And are we done? Yes, there's life, but there's no option to the human race. Mars is not an option. So, but then that was followed quickly again 2 years later when the same technology that ONR developed discovered on a fast spreading segment of the East Pacific Rise at 21 degrees north, we came across these giant chimneys. We found them with Angus. Alvin has never found anything. It's been sent there by robotic technology. You need to remember that. because it tends to get all the credit when in fact it was the ONR vehicle systems or robotic systems that made the discovery and then sent the human operator. And now we don't even need to do that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But imagine seeing out the porthole of your window a chimney that's 40 feet tall. And I said to the pilot, I want to know how hot it is. And he said, I don't. And I said, well, we sort of have a deal here, right? And we had a thermometer on the front of Alvin that we could pick up with our manipulator. And we went up and we inserted it in the opening of one of these chimneys. And it pegged off scale. And the pilot made this great scientific observation, that's hot. And when we pulled the temperature device out, the entire thing had melted. And it turned out that it was exceeding at 650 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead. Equally important, if you got really close, hopefully with a zoom lens, you saw that for the first couple centimeters, it was clear fluid coming out. It's a clear fluid. But when that 650 degree C saw 4 degrees centigrade, it quenched. And all of that inside in solution at high temperature were what are called polymetallic sulfides. And these are anhydrite, sphalerite, chalcopyrite. And they contain commercial grade ore deposits. Commercial grade ore deposits of copper, lead, silver, zinc, and gold. Now, when you start to scale it, the mid-ocean ridge is 40,000 kilometers long. And so far, we've been finding black smokers along all of it. Not only is there 40,000 miles of black smokers making commercial grade ore deposits, all the oceanic crust used to be there. So 60-some% of the Earth that's oceanic crust all was at that site of genesis. So start scaling the amount of commercial ore that's there. And then that doesn't precipitate falls down in the form of manganese nodules or what are called cobalt-rich crust, the strategic minerals. And we're now launching a whole new blue economy of mining. And then the whole question of doing it right and doing it wrong, and that is now just really hitting us. Also, ONR worked hard to get the operating Navy to let General Instruments that had built the SAS systems for the Harris arrays that were on the Bowditch and Dutton to create a commercial version called C-beam. And ONR, Tom Pyle, back here when he was another geologist, spearheaded ONR building the first multi-beam sonars that are now pervasively on all research ships. Again, another huge, massive impact. And Larry Mayer knows this in spades, who's running, is the best mapper on the planet right now. We'll talk about that in a second. Then I had an epiphany when I took the biologists back in 1979 because the biologists weren't on the ship. And we had to wait 2 years through NSF, that whole thing, to finally get a biologist back to see the hydrothermal vents for the first time. And the first guy we took was a microbiologist by the name of Holger Janisch. So they said, well, all right, Bob, go down and find the vents, go take Holger down there. And so I said, all right. So I came back and I got in the sub and went down and took him over to, I knew where to look. I acted like it was really difficult. It wasn't. The eruptive fissure is pretty easy to find. We drove the eruptive fissure, and there's giant worms and clamps. And I had brought with me the first digital camera that RCA had just built, a charge coupled device camera. The chip was about that big. And I put it in a pressure housing, and I put it on a manipulator of Alvin so I could pick it up, and I could, like a wand, I could play with this digital camera. The first one I ever built was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, RCA. And so I'm playing with it in the back of the sub. And to do this, I had to turn my back to the portholes because there's a little 19-inch rack in Alvin. And I'm playing with the manipulator. It's on a 4-inch screen. And I'm looking at that, and all of a sudden, Holger, it's on my shoulder. And I said, so what are you doing? He said, well, I'm looking at the screen. I said, well, you got a window. He says, no, this is better. And I said, let me see if I got this right. We hauled your Fanny half around the planet, got you down to 9,000 feet, stuck your head in, and you're turning your back on the wind. He says, it's better. And that's when I punched out. I had to write a lot of papers to get tenure at Woods Hole. I went to Stanford. And I was frustrated with this trip going to work. 2.5 hours to get to the Titanic, 2.5 hours to get home. The dive in the Trieste to the Cayman Trough was 6 hours down, 6 hours up, minutes on the bottom. I said, no, we're gonna do it another way. And this is now Silicon Valley's just 7980, microprocessing, digital imagery, fiber optics. So, and with my dyslexic brain, I made a cartoon. I made this cartoon in an issue at National Geographic, December 1981. I said, this is the way to go. The heck with moving bodies, move spirits. Have an out-of-body experience. We are land animals. We want to do it from land. And I published this, and everyone said I was nuts. I went back and told my engineers what I wanted to do, and they said, you're crazy. And I said, tell me what component of this is not possible. And they looked at it, and they went, you know how engineers are. I love engineers because they're impeccably honest. And they are the most honest breed of creature I've ever worked with as an engineer, because they'll try to throw the laws of physics at it, and if they can't kill it, they then say, yeah, it's possible. And I said, you're toast. If it's possible, then do it. And I went and hired this great team in the Woods Hole MIT program, and I said, turn my silly cartoon into reality. And I presented it, and Gene Silva was then Ocean Technology at ONR then. I said, I presented it to them as a long story on how it really happened. You'll have to read the story of how it finally, the decision by ONR was made. It's a hoot. It's in my autobiography, Geographic is publishing next year, and I don't have time to tell you how it actually happened, but ONR made the decision to fund this program. And that then, the first use of it was the Titanic. And the reason I was a commander in naval intelligence. My boss back then was Admiral Thunman, Ron Thunman, who was Oppo II, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Submarine Warfare. And we had lost 2 submarines during the Cold War, the Thresher and the Scorpion. We knew what happened to the Thresher, but the Scorpion was the mystery, plus the Scorpion was carrying nuclear weapons. And it also died on war patrol, boom, and what happened was unknown. They wanted us to go back, and also at that time we were decommissioning. We just signed the SALT Treaty, and we were decommissioning a lot of nuclear platforms, and we wanted to put the nuclear containment vessels, not the high-grade core, put those in swimming pools around the country. But what do you do with these big low-level compartments? And they thought, well, put them in trenches and they'll go away. And back down into the subduction zone. And so, but let's go look at 2 that have been cooking for a while and that are far worse scenarios. They got a nuclear reactor, they got nuclear weapons, so what are they doing to the environment? They didn't want the Soviets to target my ship, the Nor, and put a satellite on me because I would lead them right to the Scorpion, which was south of the Azores in 11,500 feet of water. So I said, well, let's tell the world I'm going after the Titanic. I wanted to do that, but my deal with ONR is I'll do what you want me to do, and then maybe I'll get to do what I want to do. And so, as you know, the whole story, we went out and found the Titanic, but after we mapped the Scorpion, and from it actually learned how to find the Titanic through the debris field, taught us exactly how to find the Thresher, the Titanic, because I wasn't originally supposed to find the Titanic. The French were supposed to find it with a deep-towed sonar system. I was supposed to film it. So I only had 12 days, and everyone else had months to search, and I'm arriving on scene with 12 days, and no one knows where the Titanic is. So it was I went after the debris field. I picked it up on day 8 and walked in. But then they wanted me to, so the original one is I went to the Scorpion first, when no one was watching, and then found the Titanic, and then when I'm going back, everyone's watching. So we flipped it, and my job was, we went to the Titanic first to go inside the Titanic, because Admiral Thumman had wanted me to inside the forward torpedo room of the Scorpion. He wanted me to penetrate inside the wreckage. So this time we went first, and to great fanfare, I came off the cruise. I went on the Today Show, the Tomorrow Show, the Day After Tomorrow Show, the I don't know which show. And I was Patton on the decoy to draw the public to this cruise while my Navy team I trained out of Mare Island on the black boats, who were embedded at Woods Hole, went out and then went inside and did the job for the Scorpion. So it was, I went inside that and they did their job. Then I was then selected in 1984 to be the first chair, the first Secretary of the Navy chair in oceanography. And that's when they recommissioned me, brought me back out of the inactive reserve. I have actually 3 honorable discharges. I don't want to try for a 4th. I got 3, 1 from the Army and 2 from the Navy. And then we did quite a number of highly classified military operations that this room is not meant to be discussed. But we also, I think equally important, did a number of other things. And that was to create the joint program degree for naval officers at Woods Hole, MIT, that is going on to this very day, very active program, where naval officers come and get their master's. Nuclear submariners can stay away from their reactor for 27 months, so they're highly motivated and get the job done in less than 27 months. But then what really also happened was coming back from the Titanic, the first week I got 16,000 letters from the children that just left the room. 16,000 letters from kids from all over the United States wanted to know. We had a robot. It looked like R2-D2 that they'd just seen in the movies, but it was a real one called Jason Jr. or JJ. And they saw in that the future in underwater technology. They wanted, all the letters said the same thing. What do I have to do what you do? And the answer is take a quadruple major, which is what I did. You got to study, okay. And then I created the Jason Prize. ONR was right there and still is there with our STEM. Our STEM program with Jason has expanded dramatically to a much more massive program. With our ship, the Nautilus, we're now at sea. Probably between the Nautilus and the mobile system, we're moving up to an 8-month operating tempo this year, and we'll hit a 10-month operating tempo. So we are really out there, and I'll explain to you why it's accelerated, but we always have. Thanks to ONR, we have a Naval Academy midshipmen and Coast Guard Academy cadets as role models, serving in the Corps, and also young people from 15 on up that then because of National Geographic and my wife, who's a television producer at National Geographic, they gave us a complete television production studio that we can go into any middle school, we can mentor. Here we are. You might recognize a certain somebody on one of the cruises. Tom, you were there somewhere. No, you were on a later cruise. Yeah. So this is Frank, and then this is Larry right here lecturing. And it's a floating laboratory of kids, but in doing serious stuff. And they know that sometime during the course of it, they're going to be on stage. They know that they're going to be going out to their classroom. And we have the ability to go to any classroom in the United States. I told the kids here that ONR kids have special status, and that if any classroom that your kids go to want to be, just tell Tom or Reggie, and we will guarantee you that we will broadcast live programming into your schools. Right, Allison? This is Allison Fundis, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the Ocean Exploration Trust. Denise Armstrong, who makes sure we fill out all our forms and do all the, Jason Fay, who will be joining us, and Larry Mayer. So we got a great team, but we will definitely continue reaching children in great numbers. I went on after that sort of on a binge to look at about everything that ever got lost in the ocean. The Titanic's sister ship, the Britannic, at the historic Battle of Gallipoli. Then we went to solve the mystery of what sank the Lusitania, all sponsored by the National Geographic Society, using ONR technology, but sponsored by National Geographic. I've been an explorer at large for them, not as long as ONR. I've only been working with Geographic 45 years, so I'll never catch up. But anyway, Bismarck, on the list goes, PT-109. We went on quite a binge because National Geographic enjoyed that. I think I overdid it because everyone thinks I'm a wreck person. I may be a wreck, but I'm not a wreck person. I'm a geologist, but it's not the worst rap sheet. Guadalcanal, working with the Navy, Subdev Group 1, and Ballast Point with the Seacliff and the Turtle and their ATV, tracking down the Yorktown in 18,000 feet of water. Again, then went back into history, going as far back as we could, proving that the ancient mariners followed trade routes, going into the Black Sea after in the oxygenated Mediterranean, the ship has been eaten, although if you dig down here, you get the bottom of the ship because it's anoxic. But then we went into the Black Sea. And that is, we'll be headed back, actually, to the Black Sea. And this is where there's no oxygen. This is where the oxygen is anoxic. There's no, above just the upper layer, less than about 100 meters of water coming in at the Bosporus sill. This is the largest concentration of hydrogen sulfide in solution. Again, deadly, and you have perfectly preserved ships. Here's look at this. This has been underwater for 2 millenniums, and it's brand new, still has beeswax drippings on it. This ship is from a 350 BC ship with human remains and all their DNA. They estimate there are 3 million shipwrecks yet to be discovered. So think of the chapters of human history. I tell the kids that we talk to that their generation will explore more of Earth than all previous generations combined. So what are we doing? What are we doing for you lately? We've been working a lot in understanding how to instrument the bottom. We work every year with Ocean Network Canada. We'll be back up there, in the month of June? July. Follow it live. This is the most recent thing that just happened. We competed, a group of us. Here they are, Woods Hole, University of Southern Mississippi, University of New Hampshire, University of Rhode Island, and the Ocean Exploration Trust competed on a national competition to become the Ocean Exploration Cooperative Institute to conduct the second Lewis and Clark expedition, to map the 50% of our country that lies underwater. So this is all of our real estate that we own. And if we can ever sign the Law of the Sea Convention, we had a lunch, lunch yesterday about trying to get 6 senators to sign the treaty so we can claim even more. It's called the Extended Continental Shelf. But this, like the Lewis and Clark expedition, will change the economy of our country. Prior to Lewis and Clark's exploration of Louisiana Purchase, when Jefferson doubled the size of the United States by acquiring that property for $21 million, changed the economy. Prior to that, we were based upon tobacco and cotton and shipping. And after the Louisiana Purchase, wheat, corn, cattle, mining, on the list goes of what happened when the West was opened up. The same is true for beneath the sea. We will not be able to feed the world when we hit 10.5 billion, and we hit 10.5 billion people in 2050. 30 years from now, we will lack the farmlands to feed the people of the planet, and that's if they're all vegetarians. So we're going to have to turn to the sea for food. We're going to have to turn to the sea for resources, certainly rare earths. So our job is to take all of this amazing technology where ONR spent such a spearheading leadership in the development of now autonomous vehicles, both surface vehicles and underwater vehicles, and go out and map the 50% of our country that lies beneath the sea as we do the second Lewis and Clark, although I point out that it's not the Lewis and Clark. I just introduced you to Alice and Denise. 55% of our core are women, in positions of leadership and authority. So we're going to modify that to the Lois and Clark expedition. I want to thank you for 55 years of support, and rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. As you can see, I just got funded for another 10 years to work in this battlefield. So thank you very much, Tom, and if you have any questions.